Have an opening prayer in honor of the Feast of the Annunciation from Father DeHone. This is one of his prayers for Feast of Mary. So we'll start in the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Amen. Loving God, in your care for us, you called Mary to bear your beloved Son and to be near him when he gave his life for us. May we follow her example, holding fast to your word and offering ourselves as your servants. May we proclaim the greatness of your mercy, which raises up the lowly and fills the hungry with good things. Together with Mary, our mother, we offer you our prayer, our apostolic ministry, and our service of love. Accept our spiritual worship to the glory of your name. Amen. And a brief introduction to Dr. Blackwood. I had the good fortune of having Dr. Blackwood twice as a professor when I was in the Coronum program at Sacred Heart. His official bio, Jeremy W. Blackwood, is an associate professor of systematic theology at Sacred Heart Seminary and School of Theology in Hales Corners, Wisconsin. He is the author of And Hope Does Not Disappoint, Love, Grace, and Subjectivity in the Work of Bernard J.F. Lonergan, S.J., as well as articles in Theological Studies, Irish Theological Quarterly Method, Journal of Lonergan Studies, and several edited volumes. His research interests focus on Bernard Lonergan's theology and philosophy, Trinitarian theology, and fundamental theology, along with a burgeoning interest in the interface of systematic theology and spirituality. Now, if some of you, if that makes you nervous at the level of discourse that this presentation might take, have no fear, because as his former student, I can tell you he can make the most theologically thick concepts into very vibrant, interesting discussions and really bring the spirit of thought out into the world. So with all ado, Dr. Blackwood, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Monica. I'll tell you all, like, having Monica as a student was an interesting experience. She's a hard worker. She's very bright, and she asked some really hard questions. Kept me on my toes and made me work for my paycheck. That's all right, though. So what I'm going to do is share my screen here. Where did it go? My keynote presentation. That. There we go. And there we go. Okay. Now, what I'm going to do is, first of all, this opening image here is, this is the Basilica of the Sacred Heart in Paris. This is the interior of it, which I thought was a fitting image to put on the front page of the PowerPoint here. But what I want to do today is talk us through just an outline of the encyclical to begin with, really. And that's the most of the time, because it's going to allow me to talk about the substance that I want to get to. For those of you who've read it, if you've been able, this should, just sort of help to recollect it. If you haven't had a chance to read it, I would highly recommend it. It's a great document. No document out of Rome is a perfect document, but it's a good one. It is. And then once we've sort of walked through the document, I'm going to draw out a few key points that I really want to focus our attention on. And then I want to end by talking about what this really means for things like reparation and self-offering. And that really gets us to the point of, where does it matter for our Christian life and our ministries, and the various ways in which we sort of try to bring Christ's love into the world. So the outline first. There's 5 chapters in the document. And these are not the titles, these are my ways of saying what's in them. But basically, Pope Francis begins by talking about the heart and why it matters, especially in today's world. And then he turns his attention to Jesus, and he looks at the way Jesus lived out love. And then he zeroes in on the actual heart of Christ, where that love came from, in a sense. And then he turns his attention to the idea of drinking in divine love. And I'll unpack that a little bit, but it's a great image for the way that the Sacred Heart works in our Christian lives. And then the last chapter is really about pouring out that divine love. Once you've taken it in, you pour it out for others. There's a definite logic to the document overall. So I'll go through each of these chapters and sort of unpack what it's doing and what I want you to notice about it, especially with an eye toward Lent. And I do want to mention real quick before I dive in a little more. I think this document is a great Lenten read. And by the time we get to the end today, hopefully I'll have shown you why. But it really helps you think through, who am I? What's my heart like? Where am I being like Christ's heart? Where am I not? And what do I need to pray about and work on to be more Christ-like? Which is all, it's a big part of what Lent's about. Okay, so in the first chapter, the big question in the first chapter is, what is the heart? The challenge is, Pope Francis never says, this is exactly what I mean with this word, which is a little frustrating, but it's the way a lot of encyclicals work. They're not technical pieces most of the time. But if you really pay attention to what he's doing in the document, and this works in dialogue with Father Dejon as well, the heart really is the place where all of the pieces of yourself come together into your I, your self. This includes what you think and what you feel and all these sort of mental sorts of things, but it also includes the physical sorts of things. That's your arm, that's your foot, however you want to think about, the image. And the whole us is bodily as well, right? So the I, the heart, is the place where all of that is sort of held together as one thing. And he's very clear that it goes beyond our intellect and even our will. It's more than just what you can sort of intellectually know, and it's more than just what you're trying to do. It's the who's trying to do it and the who knows it. That's really the thing. It's the place also where we resonate with other human beings. And by resonate there, I put it in these quotes because I can't think of a good word other than resonate. But when you have a relationship with someone, there's a certain, if you're an audiophile, hopefully this will make sense. There's a certain sort of tonal harmony with that person, right? That's why I use the word resonate. You're in the same key. You're not necessarily playing the same notes, but you're in the same key. And that's why the heart is also the place where poetry resonates with us and where we encounter messages that the mind alone cannot communicate. Those are Francis's words there, right? This is how, good friends or married couples can communicate with a glance. Or on her rougher days, I can communicate with a glance at my daughter that tells her to stop doing whatever she's doing. That counts too. So Francis says, okay, if this is the center of us, what really needs to happen is that all of our actions need to be put under, he calls it the political rule of the heart. In other words, the heart needs to be in charge, not the intellect, not even just the will, but the heart, that center of you. In the second chapter, having said that about the heart, he talks then about how we see Christ's heart. And what do we see when we see Christ's heart? And the big thing here is that Christ seeks people out. He treats people with a sense of mutual belonging and proximity. He goes to where people are. He, he gets critiqued, right, for spending time with sinners, but that's the people, right? And when I say mutual belonging, he makes them feel like someone cares, like they aren't tossed aside. Whereas a lot of the rest of civilization makes especially sinners feel like they're tossed aside and no one cares. He's concerned also, this is all from what Francis says. He's concerned, Jesus is, for persons as individuals. And the way I put it is, he's concerned for individuals, warts and all, right? What you do wrong, your errors, your mistakes, the thing about you that's not perfect doesn't prevent Christ from caring about you as an individual and loving who you are. And Francis says in the document, and I love this move that he makes, he learned that from his mother. Jesus learned that from his mother. And I find that fascinating. There's a sense in which, as incarnate, as human, Christ learns a lot from his mother. But Mary is only able to be the way she is because of the grace that comes from her son. So there's this mutuality there that's fascinating to me. Francis doesn't unpack that all the way, but the more I've meditated on that aspect of it, it's really struck me. Francis also notes that Jesus's words are important, but the words are windows to the depths of Jesus, his heart, which includes felt human emotions, right? Jesus is God, but if you emphasize that to the point that you forget that he's human, you're missing part of the point. And in large part in Dilexit nos, one of the things that you get is Francis likes this devotion because it reminds us of the real humanity of Christ, that he felt emotion, good and bad, good and bad, right? Emotion can be a wild thing. But really when you think about how these words, what he says are windows to his depths, Francis says the cross is the most eloquent word that Christ gives us. It's not like a spoken word. It's what he did is a word, right? Which is fascinating if you think about what that tells us or how we treat other people. Right? What you do for them is a word to them in a certain respect. Now, if we think about the third chapter, then, and we turn our attention to Christ's heart specifically, then sorry, my daughter was trying to come in here. Um, she's on spring break. If we think about Christ's heart specifically, we have to sort of think about what do we mean with this image, the Sacred Heart of Christ? And Francis is very careful to say that we venerate the image, but we worship Christ. The image is a way to worship Christ. You don't just sort of segregate his heart off from the rest of him and worship that and leave the rest of Christ to the side. That's not the idea. Um, and the reason this works is because the image of the heart represents the whole person, right? And so again, if we go back to the heart, meaning it's that I, that center of you, then it's the place where all of you finds its connection. And so if you have an image of the heart, you have an image that represents all of someone. So in the case of the Sacred Heart of Christ, what we see is that the image of the heart indicates that Christ's divine love is inseparable from his human love. If the heart is the place where all of you comes together, and in his case, all of him includes both human and divine, the heart is the place where the two come together. Because if you sort of think about it, I don't want to get overly technical, but if you think about it a little bit, in his experience of himself, I'm not sure that Jesus could have always told you, this part of me is divine, this part of me is human. It's one experience for him as incarnate. And that one experience is because he's got the one part in that way. Now, as the divine Son of God, Christ has a divine love for God and for us. But as incarnate, Christ has a human love for God and for us. So there's layers to this, sort of, right? Because he's both God and human, he can love us as God and love us as a fellow human being. And those loves are united, then, brought together in his one heart. And what that means for us is that this works more easily if you think about the first disciples, especially, but it's the same is true for us. It's by encountering him as human that you actually have the path by which you encounter the divine love for us. If you think about the people that met him, they did not know he was God right off the bat. They had to figure that out. I mean, well, and I say figure that out, this is revealed to you, but it took time, they had to be prepared for that. When he first points at someone and says, "Hey, you follow me," they think he's, they don't know that he's not just human. It's that humanity that provides the doorway, the entrance point by which we can really come to an experience of the divine love. And that's all centered in the heart. Now, Francis talks about why this matters. And in the first chapter, he does talk about why it matters, but I kind of skipped over that because partly for time. I have the advantage in my other presentations for the Dahonians where I have 3 presentations. I could dig in more. This I had to sort of compress. But the reason why the devotion arises, even historically, but Francis thinks this is still why it matters. So there are problems historically, 1600s, 1700s, and we have the same problems in slightly different forms today. And it basically comes down to the idea of pushing back against a rigorous morality and spiritualism and a disembodied or sort of an intellectualized spirituality, right? And the idea, I'll finish the slide here, but then I'll talk a little more just to sort of make sure these make some sense. Both of these problems have the same root. In a sense, they both treat our faith as an abstraction. They disconnect it from real life. So when it comes to the morality question, sometimes we forget that the rules are made for us. We're not made just to follow the rules, right? We aren't made for the Sabbath. The Sabbath was made for us. By which I mean, our whole life is not about following the rules the right way. Instead, the rules are the way they are because they show us a path to life. That's the idea. But if that's the case, it means you can't just center yourself on treating morality in this sort of black and white sort of sense. Instead, it's you work on it. It takes time. It takes formation. If working in a seminary has taught me anything, it's the significance of formation, not just for the men, but for me, it's made me more aware of it for myself and in parenting, etc. Um, it takes time. And no one's spiritual life is a straight upward line. There's always sort of missteps and back steps, and and if you don't understand that in your spiritual life and in your moral life, you either are going to be too hard on yourself and or too hard on others, and that helps no one. It's a similar sort of thing with the spirituality, the disembodied or intellectualized spirituality. Our faith is about our whole selves. It includes our feelings, it includes our experiences. It doesn't just include what we think. And this is coming from a systematic theologian, right? Um, my natural gifts are on the think side. It's the other stuff, the feeling and experience, the aesthetics and the spiritual practice that I have to deliberately work on. But that's also helped me see the significance of those things. Um, and devotion to the Sacred Heart helps us remember that whole, that's really what's important. And that what we think, the intellectual part, is a part of that, but not the whole. So I think when he talks about sort of the reasons for the devotion and the reasons for him drawing attention to it, he's onto some important pieces there in the modern world, because we suffer from these issues inside the church and outside the church. We suffer from these issues. Now we get to some of the cool, some of my favorite image. Cool. There's my professional term for it, right? But some of the really neat imagery that's involved here in this document for how do you do the devotion, sort of how do you think about how you do it, what it's doing, etc. The way I put it on here, what does this all mean in our spiritual experience? So he points out, Francis does, that the Old Testament and the first Christians used the metaphor of water to show our thirst for God. You get that all over the Old Testament. It also appears in the New. And then what happens in the church is that the blood and water from the side of Christ, when he gets pierced, the blood and water from the side of Christ came to be thought of as the flow from his heart, like a material, tactile, like we all know what it feels like to put our hand under a flow of water, even if it's just a faucet, right? It's even better if it's out in nature somewhere, but we know what that feels like. That came to be thought of as sort of the image or the material representation of the flow of grace out from Christ's heart. And when you think of that piercing, his wounds link the past and the present, because even as resurrected, he still has the wounds, right? If you think of the story of Doubting Thomas, the wounds are still there, right? Francis points out that through the lens of the Sacred Heart, we can understand that means we can be present to those wounds. When Christ is present to us and we are present to Christ, those wounds are there. That also means, since time's a little funny when you get into the resurrection, right? We're present to his wounding, right? The sins that caused the wounds aren't just the sins at his time or the sins leading up to that time. It includes all of them ever, which means the ones now, the ones that we do. And so there's a sense in which we're present to his wounding even now. That sounds maybe bad in a certain respect. It sounds a little rough, but it also means that we can offer Christ our current suffering. We can join him, in a sense, participate with him, right? Never at the same level. He's God, we are not, but we can offer him our suffering, because if he has wounds, but he's resurrected, and those wounds have been transformed and transfigured, the same thing can happen to our wounds if we can unite them with him. That's the idea. It doesn't make our wounds not wounds anymore. It just changes what they meant. And I'll talk more about that towards the end, actually. The fourth, or no, still with the drinking, okay? These are two quotes that I thought were very good, and they really sort of drive home part of what he's after. God offers us consolation, and here he's quoting 2 Corinthians, so that we may be able to console those who are in any affliction with the consolation by which we ourselves are consoled by God. Right? So when we are wounded, God offers us consolation. But what he gives us then enables us to console others. Right? Already you can hear there that sort of transforming your wounds into something that allows you to give forth to others then. Right? Doesn't take the wounds away. If you didn't have those wounds, you wouldn't be in a position to help someone else. Right? I had a friend one time that sometimes rubbed people the wrong way. And I was struck at one point by someone who told me, be a friend for her by being what you would have needed if you were in her shoes. Right? Which is a great way to think about it. Be for others what you would have needed if you were in their shoes. But you only know how to do that if you've also been wounded. If your life's been perfect and you've never had any wounds, you have no idea how to deal with wounded people because you don't know what it's like. That's sort of a similar thing here, but just elevated even higher because there's a Christ, divine element there. And then Francis says, this then challenges us to seek a deeper understanding of the communitarian, social, and missionary dimension of all authentic devotion to the heart of Christ. For even as Christ's heart leads us to the Father, it sends us forth to our brothers and sisters. Everyone listening to this should go, oh, that sounds like a Dahotian charism, right? If you didn't have that reaction, let me know. We can talk because that struck me so much there. That pair of sentences. I said that sounds like ESTJs. That's the idea. That very union with Christ's heart goes out, then pours outward. We'll talk more about that in a moment as well. Speaking of the pouring out, this is a little bit more about it. All right. Here, Francis quotes John Paul II. And I think sometimes Francis is thought of as social justice-y, as though his two predecessors weren't, except they were too. There is a lot in both of them that sort of is like looking at issues of justice and questions of social order. And it goes back beyond them as well. But here, Francis is quoting John Paul II, and he says, a society is alienated if its forms of social organization, production, and consumption make it more difficult to offer the gift of self and to establish solidarity between people. In other words, if you have a society where it's easier to stay home and order what you need instead of going out and interacting with other human beings, it's going to have this problem. I am not absenting myself from that either. I have an Amazon order arriving today. So, like, I'm guilty as well. But that's just one example, right? And we see the effects of that, the vast sort of um, divergences in how people interact with one another nowadays, and the conflicts in our civilization because we just don't know each other. Um, he also says then that it is our conversion of heart that imposes the obligation to repair these structures. It is our response to the love of the heart of Jesus, which teaches us to love in turn. Right. And again, you have that link between what happens in your heart and what you're able to do out there for others. Right? And I did put, in case you haven't noticed it yet, this picture on this slide is Father Dejon with some SCJ missionaries about to head off to the Congo. Right. So this idea is very much in him, and then up into the Dehonian charism, I would say. In a sense, and reparation I'll revisit too. But this is reparation, or at least part of it. If each of us considers his or her own sins and their effect on others, we will realize that repairing the harm done to this world also calls for a desire to mend wounded hearts where the deepest harm was done and the hurt is most painful. What's fascinating about that, right, is it moves from considering your sin to addressing wounded hearts. It's not a matter of you sinned, feel guilty for it. You see the difference I'm after there. Hopefully that makes sense. Where it's this attention to people's hearts. We actually in Corunum last night we were talking about Dilexit Notes. I've introduced Dilexit Notes to my spring course for them, and one of the things that came up was this point here, and I reminded them of that phrase, hurt people hurt people. You know, that phrase where it's like, people who are wounded are the ones who then often go on to do the wounding because they've been wounded themselves. And there's something not formed correctly then, right? Um, it's really by addressing that woundedness that things improve. Asking forgiveness is a means of healing relationships, right? Anyone who's married and or in religious life should understand that line right there. A heart capable of compunction will grow in fraternity and solidarity. The sense of solidarity born of compunction also enables reconciliation to take place. You have to be willing to say, I should not have done this. I'm sorry. And that's centered on the idea of the relationship we have with Christ's own heart. The thing is, you can't really do that if you are intimidated by or sort of put off by the person that you would have to approach to apologize to them, right? The person you're going to apologize to has to, in a certain respect, have a welcoming openness to the apology. Otherwise, you can't do it. It's too hard to do it. So it really does require sort of both sides of that. Right? All of which is to say, Christ's heart manifests an unlimited openness to welcome us back. Right? Prodigal son just did so. Mission then becomes a radiation of the love of the heart of Christ. I love that way of putting that. Right? It's almost like another way that the image that comes to my mind is you put a stone into a pond and the ripples go out, that kind of a thing. It requires missionaries who are themselves in love and who, enthralled by Christ, feel bound to share this love that has changed their lives. This love then becomes service within the community. If we are concerned with helping others, this in no way means that we're turning away from Jesus. Rather, we're encountering him in another way. His love becomes present through our service. He speaks to the world in a language that at times has no need of words. It comes back around to the idea of Christ's words being important, but really his actions are the word that he expresses in a lot of ways. The language words falls within that broader category of the stuff that he does, his service. All right, so if we pull some points out of this, okay, we can look at it this way. A renewed devotion to the Sacred Heart is needed today. Okay, that's a key thing that Francis is after. And this is my way of saying it, but what he's after is we need a spirituality. We need a lived practice. We don't just need theology. Right? I'm a theologian. Theology is important. Don't get me wrong. So, don't stop signing up for Corunum or whatever, or, all that stuff. We need the theology. But what really matters is how you live your faith. That's the thing. And something I think in a lot of ways we've lost. I think religious communities like the SCJs have sustained this in a way that your average Catholic maybe hasn't as well. But over the last several decades, maybe even 50 or 60 years, we've lost some sense of sort of the ground level popular devotion sorts of things that sort of kept things rolling in certain ways. That's not the only way to do it, but we've lost some of that. And I told my students last night, Vatican II is it serves as a time marker for sort of when that kind of thing changed, but there's nothing in Vatican II that actually caused that. It's kind of a conundrum exactly what happened there, but we need that sense of lived practice, a lived spirituality. We need one that is open to the aesthetic, the felt aspects of our faith. And that we have lost some since Vatican II. I love the parish that I attend. I love the people. I do not love the architecture. And it's not the most aesthetically fascinating building. But it's that kind of thing matters, and I think sometimes we forget that. One of my favorite things about the chapel at the seminary is those tremendous triangles around, because there's 12 of them, and deliberately 12 of them, and there's this sense of, in the back of my mind, there's an apostle's face on each of them, like looking down on us. So it doesn't all have to be like old style aesthetics. That's not what I mean. But that aspect matters, right? I think to a certain extent we need to renew some popular devotions, and I think this is partly what Francis is getting at here, because we need to sort of penetrate the faith down further into the roots of our everyday lives. We all struggle with prayer life. We all do. That's one thing, especially as I've gotten older, I've realized it's okay that I struggle with that, because so does everybody else. So even the priests. So Father Jim is nodding. That makes me see, that's comforting to me. Yes. And we need these because we live in a world that denies the value of a lot of these things. We live in a world that denies the value of empathy and emotion and sensitivity to one another. And it denies the value of things that are sort of imprecise and hard to define, like the heart. Um, but really, those are the things that we need in order to be fully human. Those imprecise things, those messy things, that's what we have to have, especially if we're going to deal with this sort of increasingly technocratic and bureaucratic and materialist consumerist world. Because to a large extent, we're already treated like sort of cogs in an economic machine, right? Sort of dehumanized and just turned into mechanism. And what we need is something that is open to a deeper side or aspect of life. Christ is the key, right? In him, this is where divine love meets human love. Back to that point again, right? And divine love is expressed humanly. When we encounter Christ, that allows us to imitate his love. When we imitate his love, we are imitating the love of a divine person, the love of God. And when we do that, we can love others as God does. What the devotion does, I think, is form us in that, right? We drink from the side of Christ and we dwell in his wounds, which are two really key points that Francis draws our attention to. It feeds us his gracious love as that love pours out of his wounded heart. And it forms us because we're meditating upon the wounds of Christ as concrete, as touchable, as I said before. Think St. Thomas, Doubting Thomas. They're touchable representations of his love for us, right? His wounds are manifestations of what his love moved him to do for others. So they're tactile. And Christ's love then overflows as we're formed by and even formed into Christ's love, then that overflows to others and we become missional. We evangelize by word and perhaps even more so by action. We draw others to Christ by being Christ for them. And then we work to expand the kingdom of the Sacred Heart, right? So this is language that right there, kingdom of the Sacred Heart, I get from the things of D'Hones that I've come across. But it's really sort of that's the kingdom of God. This is a social order where charity, the love of Christ, sort of becomes the organizing principle of all human interaction. So what's this mean for things like reparation, right? One of the lines in this encyclical that struck me the most was this one here about reparation. And this line is why the second part of the title of this talk is "And the Layers of the Heart." If we understand reparation as the removal of the obstacles that we've placed that get in the way of Christ's love expanding, then what we need is a way to remove those obstacles. Right? Meditation on the Sacred Heart is one way to drink from and dwell in the wounds of Christ to accomplish this. If we drink from what's flowing forth from him, that empowers us with the grace to change, to grow holier, to grow in service to others, that missional impulse. If we dwell in his wounds, this is part of the encyclical that I had to ponder over longer to wrap my head around, that if we dwell in his wounds, what happens is we more and more and more appreciate the character of his heart. This is why it matters that those wounds are like markers of what he was willing to do for us. Those can show us where and how we need to grow holier. the things that we have to be willing to change or even be rid of in order to be more like Him, in order for our heart to be more like His. If you think of it, we are created for union with the Father. So somewhere in there, in each of us, is a heart that longs to be united to the Father. Even in people who say, there is no God, I'm just here for the money, whatever, somewhere in there is a heart that longs to be united to the Father. But in every single one of us, that heart is buried beneath sin, anxiety, malformations, the pressures of things like, work and parenting and relationships and more. I mean, I have discovered, and this is something else you'll all resonate with, working in the church and in ministry does not prevent that problem. It can help. Sometimes it can make it worse. It depends exactly how things are going. But what really has to happen is we have to peel back the layers. We have to engage in a removal of those obstacles to truly serve as a pathway from Christ's heart to the hearts of the people in the world. But that hurts. It's painful. You have to give up stuff. A lot of if you have to confront your own sins, that requires a high level of honesty and self-reflection. If you have anxiety that you deal with and you have to confront it, right? I mean, I think of a lot of, some of the seminarians, they're sort of naturally inclined to the intellectual stuff. And when it comes to the dealing with people part, that's what they have to work on. Some of them are the other way around. But we all have things that are anxieties that we have to wrestle with. That's hard. It's painful. It's scary. The same thing with malformations. There may be things about you that are the way you were raised or things like that. And changing that is hard and it's very frightening. But you have to peel those back to get rid of those obstacles, to get through the layers, to get to what's really at the bottom. Ultimately, we do it by uniting our sufferings to Christ's sufferings. Without Christ, our sufferings are meaningless. They just become places where there's disorder and pain and an absence of fulfillment. They're just holes in our lives. With Christ, our sufferings become meaningful. It's no longer a place of disorder. It's a place where order was brought out of disorder and a new purpose is given. It's no longer just a place of pain. It's a place where you learned a lesson from that pain, and the pain isn't the final word. It's no longer just an absence of fulfillment. It's a place where you move from that absence to fulfillment and learn lessons along the way that you could impart to others. In no way does it make these not painful. In no way does it make them not still wounds, but it changes what they mean. In Christ's case, he still has the wounds, but what they don't mean anymore is Rome killed him and ended the threat, so to speak, from their point of view. His wounds don't mean that anymore. That's what Rome thought they would mean. But now his wounds mean this is what God is willing to do for us and to offer us. And the least we could do is work on ourselves to remove the layers that are in the way of us at least trying to do the same for others. So this is why I say I think this is a good reading for Lent, if you think about it this way. Where part of what we're trying to attend to is what are the things that get in the way of my right relationship with God? And this is a good way to think about it and link it to the Sacred Heart, link it to popular devotion and prayer life, but also link it to the missional elements, right? It's a great encyclical in a lot of ways. There's a lot of really good stuff in it. This easily was the most exciting that my Corunum students have been about a reading in a while. They really, really enjoyed it, and got a lot out of it. So if you haven't had a chance to read it, I highly recommend it. But at the very least, you can sort of think through what I've talked about here and think about what do you need to peel away so that you can serve as this sort of pathway for the flow of Christ's love and grace in the world. Thanks. Where's my, sorry, I can't, I've lost my like mouse thing, so I can't hit the stop share. Where'd it go?
I'll stop it.
There we go. Okay, thank you. Yeah, that was weird. Okay. Anyway, okay, there. Sorry.
I guess
Piece of
I'll
fuzz.
just say thank you so much for that. And Sister Kathleen, do you want to lead any Q&A?
Okay, let me bring us all back to the same screen. We're all on the same screen, so if you can raise your hand to ask a question or make a comment, please do so. If you can't, just go ahead and unmute yourself and speak. The group's small enough that that will work.
Ruth.
Mark.
I know Ruth. That's Ruth.
Please be sure to unmute yourself.
Sure. I just want to say thank you. This was really beautiful, and for knowing Dr. Blackwood since he was starting here, it's really enjoyable to see this devotional side that you shared with us. And I feel like there's just so much that I can take away from this, and so much self-reflection that I need during Lent. And I just wanted to say thank you.
You are welcome, Ruth. Thank you. I mean, it's funny. Like I said, the devotional side is what I have to deliberately work on. Like, I've kind of always been that way. And I mean, it's not. I mean, for a while, it was like that's bad, and I've kind of gotten to a point where I'm like, nope, that's just who I am. That's okay. I have students like that. They need that. They need a professor that understands that sometimes. And but it is really fascinating to be in a position where I have someone like Father DeHone to study. I mean, I didn't talk about him as much today, but because it's been kind of fascinating in a lot of ways. And one of the things I mentioned to the students last night is the Sacred Heart devotion comes out of a time in Catholic history that we don't give tons of attention to sometimes. That sort of, late 1600s up until mid 1800s, we just don't do as much with. Like in a lot of history classes, it's, here's the medieval period, here's the Reformation, and poof, here's Vatican I. Like it's, we just sort of skip over that. And yet there's piles of devotional practices that arise then in a time period of massive social and governmental change. And it's not that different from now, where sort of there's a lot of questions about what is the position of the church in the world. And I have a suspicion that in the at least back of Francis's mind is, yeah, we need to turn our attention back to some of those things, because we collectively got a benefit out of that for a while, but it kind of fizzled, and we need some of that again. And I would say I need some of that again. I mean, so it's great to have my personal and my professional sort of be able to come together in this way.
Father Jim, don't forget to unmute.
Okay, can you hear me now? Yeah, you can hear me. On this devotional thing, I think you're really on to something. Before Vatican II, when the liturgy was in Latin and we were not encouraged to read scripture at all, devotional life became the bulk of most people's faith life or religious life. They'd go to mass, but say their rosary. And I do think Vatican II contributed to reducing that because they really urged us to have a spiritual life, a devotional life that was based in sacrament and in scripture. And one of the things about Dehon coming out of the French school was very much a devotional life that was based on the core creeds. So it's truly a lived creed in the spiritual life. Now, the whole issue of the 1600s, the 1700s with Margaret Mary, we really got stuck with that devotion, and it got very icky and theologically wrong. Not Humanae Vitae, Arietis Aquas, Pope Pius XII's encyclical on the Sacred Heart, really tried to counteract that, to get away from the soupy, sentimental imagery, the art, and so on. And, the kind of crazy promises that if you did X, Y, and Z, you were guaranteed salvation. That was wrong. And I think we each need to invent our own devotion to the Sacred Heart. Anytime you return love for love, the readmatio, is a devotion to the heart of Christ. And Dehon originally called us oblates, and when that was shut down, we became priests of the Sacred Heart, but he wanted to call us priest victims of the Sacred Heart, which ties into that whole woundedness and how we can offer ourselves, including our wounds and our hurts and sufferings, before each action of the day, which can become a new devotion of the heart of Christ, to offer ourselves to Christ in love, for his love. I think we also need then to find our own imagery, an imagery of the Sacred Heart that really speaks to us. And there's some really good stuff out of there, but there's a lot of crap. It's awful. So I think you really have to be very selective, and then to find something other than rote prayer or rattling beads. What is my personal way of speaking my devotion to the heart of Jesus and showing that to people, sharing that with people? And I think that's where we need to get creative, because I can't dictate for you nor you for me, but we can each find a way that speaks to our heart and keeps us in touch with our heart.
I think so. Yeah, that's helpful, especially what you said about the Vatican II stuff there. Let me start with that. I saw when I said that, when I was on that slide, I saw you make like a pondering sort of face. Yours was one of the faces, like, and I thought, okay, Father Jim's got a thought there. And yeah, that does, yeah, that what you said there is helpful. That makes some sense. Yeah. I think the reason that I say, Vatican II didn't necessarily cause it is I don't want to lay blame at the feet of Vatican II. I don't want it to be a negative sort of thing. But I do understand what you mean there about the shift in sort of devotional, the ask of the church there. Yeah, and I also think we need, each person has to find their way to enact this sort of devotion. I do think the document is careful to address some of the missteps in the history of the devotion. He addresses those things directly but lightly, I would say. Um, and he doesn't actually advocate for any single particular way of practicing the devotion, which I also think is kind of fascinating. It's more open-ended, sort of the way you're describing, where folks have to find their own way to do it. I think for some, at least some of the older practices may resonate with them, but I think we also have to be careful um, that it's done well and done for the right reasons. There's a way of rattling beads, to use your phrase, to rattle beads. And there's a way of rattling beads to actually meditate, I mean, and that's, and if that resonates with some folks, it's not going to resonate with everybody, that's for sure. People need to find the way that does resonate with them. I'm using that word again now that I think about it, but they need a way that resonates with them, and to find a way to connect their woundedness to Christ's woundedness, because he is the key for those wounds to not have the final say. And when you were talking about Father de Home, and even just the sort of missionary impulse in sort of modern North American SCJs, that the ministries that you all engage in is a way of being present with wounded people. And we live in a world where there's a whole lot of woundedness. And I don't know that there's more than there ever was, but maybe we just are a little more collectively aware of that. I'm not sure exactly, but folks need a way for that woundedness to not have the final answer. And I think, there's an awful lot of instances where the woundedness drives the decisions people make, whether it's interacting with people in a customer service environment or on the highway, or whether it's who they're voting for. It's, or even whether or not they like a particular priest. I mean, woundedness drives an awful lot, and we need a better way to deal with it. Yeah.
Father Joseph has a question.
Thank you, Dr. Blackwood, for the presentation. I have been thinking about some of the reactions I have from people concerning Dilexit nos. I want to summarize a little bit your argument here. We need to rediscover the importance of heart because we live in a world that denies emotions, feelings, and so on. So based on this, some people think Dilexit nos encourages sentimentalism. How do you respond to that?
I think you can encourage the value of sentiment without pushing for sentimentalism. And what I mean is, if you let the way you feel be the sole governing criterion by which you make your decisions and perform your spirituality, etc., that's a horrible idea. That's a terrible idea. It's like a young couple that dives into a relationship solely because of how they feel, and they never think it through, and they're never like, this other person's not good for me, or whatever it might be. Sentimentalism results when you let how you feel take the leading control. If the heart, though, is about the whole you, yeah, it goes beyond intellect and will, but it's not without them. They come along too. every part, when he talks about the political rule of the heart, one of the things that would have to mean, he doesn't really lay this out, but one of the things I think that would have to mean is every piece of you is given its due spot and role in the order of you, the whole ordered, arranged thing that you are. And if that's the case, then mind, intellect, those things play a role as well. This is actually, you could use that example to sort of, in relation to what Father Jim was talking about, to find a way of doing the devotion that actually resonates with you, you have to pay attention to all of those pieces. If all you pay attention to is this one feels good, it one of the problems, not the only, but one of the problems might be, then the devotion's not challenging you at all. Right? You need a devotion to challenge you some beyond where you're already at. And if it's just a sentimentalism, then it's just a matter of you do it because this feels good. And that's not all there is. You have to have all the parts in their right relationships and right order, which is going to go beyond just how you feel. That's, I think, what I would say to that question. It's a great question. It's a worthwhile question. It's sort of a question that ought to be asked. But I think that's how I would answer that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Deacon Ted.
Thank you. Dr. Blackwood, thank you, especially to all of the leadership of our province and the staff and such. More than ever, and I'm down in Mississippi with the guys and with as well as the Sacred Heart Southern Missions. I'm in my 25th year of being exposed to the SCJs as far as having been a parishioner in this area, and now in my 3rd year of working with the parishes. And I had the opportunity to read shortly after Pope Francis distributed the encyclical. So I'm glad we had the opportunity to break this open. But y'all are bringing Hale's Corner to us, and we really appreciate the opportunity. I've been able to come up twice to preaching conferences with Deacon Steve and met some of you on those trips. And then I'll mention that Father Schroeder came down for our cocktails in Catholicism, and either reaching out to Father David Sikowski or myself, we would love to have more of you come and speak to and encounter our people down here. So again, thank you to, I know Laura's on the call, Andrea's on the call, and others. And of course, Father Ed's sitting there in the room with you. I got the opportunity to get back in touch with him when I was up there the last time. So thank you again.
We should probably wrap up. I hate to end it, but we should, especially since we have a vocations mass starting in 5 minutes here. But a quick thank you, Sister Kathleen. I could sleep last night knowing that you were going to do the technology. And a huge thank you to Dr. Blackwood for the presentation. And I'll echo what Deacon Ted said, a huge thank you to the SCJs, because without your support, we could never do this. And how wonderful that you make these opportunities available to us. The Advent Recollection has over 160 views already. So I know this one will be viewed a lot as we go forward. So thank you all very much for being here today.